22 years ago today, May 17th, 2004, my home state of Massachusetts became the first state in the US to grant marriage licenses to same-sex couples. To me, this was just returning the state of affairs to what I thought they'd been, what I thought they should be, at least in my home state, because I was born and I grew up in Northampton, Massachusetts, which was known as a lesbian mecca. My mother, disproportionate number of her friends were lesbians. Our neighbor was almost like a third parent to me. And of course, a lot of these people were in couples, and I had just assumed they were married and took it for granted. And I didn't actually learn they weren't until 2003, when Howard Dean was running for the Democratic nomination for president, governor of Vermont, and he was coming under fire for Vermont being the first, and by that point, only state to have signed same-sex civil unions which granted marriage-like benefits that were not officially marriage. And so, for me, my position on marriage has been remarkably consistent my whole life, which isn't really anything necessarily about me so much as just where I grew up, which is my understanding of marriage, or what marriage should be, has been that marriage is a dedicated, exclusive commitment between two and only two people of any sex or gender, with the intention of committing for life, but with the understanding that sometimes things don't work out. And I've been reevaluating a lot of my views, challenging myself, and I've also been thinking about this because, of course, one of the predictions that the anti-marriage equality people made was that it would lead to accepting things like polyamorous marriages. And I was like, it doesn't necessarily need to. In fact, polyamory tends to just revert to traditional polygamy. And so as I understood it, well, that would be going back to like the old school polygamous marriages, whereas marriage equality, monogamy regardless of sex, was a step forward in terms of my understanding of what marriage should be. But still a minority view, but at least in the circles I'm in, there is increasing acceptance of, yeah, we should grant marriage to polyamorous people too. And I'm like, no. And I won't get into the why of that here, but it has led to me thinking, especially after also reevaluating my thoughts on gender, should I at least try to hear out the arguments of these people who disagree with me on something sort of so central, something I so strongly believe, right? And so I came across this book, and I'm also going to talk about this book by Christopher Lasch, which is sort of a history of marriage as well. This one is specifically by three guys trying to explain why they're opposed to marriage equality. And aside from being short, it seemed compelling because one of these guys is a Heritage Foundation fellow, which is a conservative think tank. One of them is the head of some American Studies program at Princeton University. Although the book, it turns out, is mostly written by the third person, who is just some random Princeton undergrad. And so I read this book, and it seems like they basically had three arguments, which are that everyone has always understood what marriage is pretty consistently, which suggests that even if you take religion out of it, it represents something outside and beyond government, which the government just codifies, and that the purpose of it is based on the complementarity of the sexes, which a general idea of companionate marriage is trying to erase, of which marriage equality was part of, which actually fits kind of with what Christopher Lasch talks about in this book, because he argues that basically we saw an evolution from the old patriarchal marriage to the companionate marriage based on the idea of two people in love, and then even that was eroding. And he wrote this in 1977, and yet even at the time there was already an increase in people like doing sort of open relationships that he said undermined even the idea of a companionate marriage, which was still supposed to be an exclusive commitment, and it was still around having a family, at least in theory. And so I think Lasch and the authors of this book have a slightly different idea on what a companionate marriage is. But regardless, as I said, they made sort of 3 points, and the first two of them, one of them I think is verifiably wrong. One of them I disagree with. But despite that, you don't actually need to believe the first two to accept the third point they're making. And so the question becomes, if you accept the third point, do you have to accept their thesis that you can't allow same-sex marriage? And my conclusion, I'll reveal now, is no, but it does change my position on some things that I had at least been questioning. So for example, as I said, I've been critical of the idea of allowing multiple group marriages, polyamorous marriages, because what I see is that they're either traditional polygamy, so one man, multiple partners, which there's a lot of reasons to be very opposed to that, or the actual polyamorous, supposedly equal relationships. They basically never work and they never last. And a friend of mine pointed out, well, if you have them between gay men, they probably would, at least with a triad. And I'm like, yeah, maybe. And so do you make an exception then? And so I will say, having read this, I'm convinced you probably shouldn't be making exceptions to general marriage policy around, hey, it might work for gay people. But I still don't think that even if you accept the third conclusion of this book, that means you need to accept their conclusion that marriage can only be between a man and a woman for reasons I'll get into. But anyways, I wanted to go over it because I've been thinking about it and about a lot of sort of stuff related to marriage. And so again, first thing that they were trying to prove or demonstrate is that marriage has basically always been understood as an exclusive commitment for life between a man and a woman, and typically monogamously. And they acknowledge later in the book that, okay, there have been polygamous marriages, but it's still about a man and a woman in sort of the complementarity for the purposes of procreation. So one thing is the dynamics of polygamous marriages and even of monogamous marriages in polygamous societies tend to be very different from the dynamics of marriage that we take for granted in Western monogamous societies. But the other thing is, if you look at primitive societies, and I have a video I've talked a bit about that, see Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes behind me, and I've pulled other books to talk about this in the past. Typically, most of human history, it seems like marriage has been understood as a relationship that lasts until one of the parties decides they want to move on, and it's typically only for a few years. So this idea that permanence is universal is nowhere near true. And indeed, both Islam and Judaism allow divorce. And I actually meant to check, because I know my understanding is Hinduism and traditional Chinese culture at least frowned on it. I think Buddhism did, or at least like Southeast Asian Buddhism. But regardless, even Islam, which we would think of as being more traditional in terms of marriage, has allowed divorce, although only the men can do it unilaterally. And so this idea that it's always been, like all cultures, the idea is it's supposed to be forever, and the state enforces that. No. And likewise, most human cultures have been mildly polygynous, so some of the most powerful, influential men might have 2 wives, maybe 3. But in general, the vast majority of women are in relationships with one man. And then you have cultures where polygamy, specifically polygyny, so one man with multiple wives, becomes much more common. And that's sort of the stereotype about like West Africa, for example. And marriage looks very different, like culturally, in ways I feel like the authors of this book don't acknowledge. And I specifically favor monogamous marriage, and I think it is part of what has made Western culture so successful, which I've also referenced Weirdest People in the World, which gets to that a bit. And I think monogamy is part of that, but also goes beyond the scope of that book. And so I'm like, okay, so this first claim they're sort of operating on, that's just flat out wrong. But is it central to the argument they're trying to make? Does the argument depend on it? And my answer is, I don't think it does, because they're also arguing, so they're arguing that marriage exists as this thing outside the state that the state just validates. And this first point being factually wrong, I think, undermines that point, and that's part of why I don't believe it. But you still have the third claim, which is that marriage is supposed to be about the complementarity of the sexes for the purpose of starting a family. And so you might think, well, inherently then, if you accept that claim, then you would have to accept that you can't have same-sex marriages. But I don't think that's true, because, as a friend of mine pointed out, most same-sex couples still have one partner who takes on the more masculine and one who takes on the more feminine role, and they can still adopt or do IVF, right? And so it may not be as ideal. So one thing that I was always incredulous about as a teenager was the idea that children might be worse off under 2 same-sex parents than under a mother and father. Because the studies all showed that there was no difference. And I was like, well, why would there be any difference? Because I just took it for granted that the gender differences were pretty small. And as I had to recognize, I think gender differences are larger than I thought. You actually would expect that probably children would be slightly better off, at least, under mother and father. And certainly, children do best under biological parents. And you have to wonder, if you have one parent being the biological parent, is the other parent as invested? And so even though the empirical studies show it, I'm like, okay, it's possible that they would be right. And so in this book, they were arguing that these studies were basically all based on upper middle class gay couples and comparing them to all married couples. And so if you're getting the same results with affluent couples who tend to have better results, then yeah, you might expect same-sex couples, if you actually were able to compare apples to apples, might do a little bit worse. But I would still be very surprised if same-sex couples did worse than single-parent households. And we accept single-parent households. And so if we accept that, I think we should be encouraging, if you have 2 people who are in love and want to have kids, allowing them to raise their kids together. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, do I accept the third claim of this book, which is that marriage is and fundamentally should be about this idea of complementarity? And is it in opposition to the idea of a companionate marriage, which again, Christopher Lasch describes the old patriarchal marriage, and that was back when women got married and like they couldn't have their own property, right? And now with like a companionate marriage, both parties own property equal in its communal assets. And the people in this book, who are authors of this book, who are all men, are saying they're not necessarily arguing for a return to that, but they're arguing for a return to the assumption that men and women bring different things to the table, and marriage around having a family should be based on that. And I think, I'm not sure they're wrong increasingly, but I also don't think that's necessarily incompatible with a companionate marriage as Christopher Lasch describes it. And it seems like a big part of their concern is that they think that allowing marriage equality sort of encourages an increase in divorce rates. And I think there's a number of things going on with divorce rates. And some of it is people who were in unhappy relationships tended to stay together just because they felt like they had no escape. And so it's good that we have an end to that. And there also are documented cases of low-income women have divorced their partners because the welfare system incentivized that, and actually they're better off, which, okay, maybe let's not do that, but that sort of gets to my broader criticism of social engineering. But I think a lot of divorce rates come from couples having incompatible expectations on certain central issues, and you'll see divorce lawyers again and again bring up a handful of issues: money, child rearing, stuff like that. And I think, like, I know a lot of people who've gotten divorced, and the stereotype is it's generally the woman leaving because she's unhappy. She doesn't feel like the partner is doing enough. But my father actually was the one who left because he was unhappy, and sort of a similar scenario to what a lot of women have had. And I think a lot of that is sort of figuring out what the new expectations should be when cultural norms shift. And I think part of it is sometimes people just do grow apart. Or sometimes people, if you marry young, or if you have low confidence, you don't understand who you marry. So I still, like, I would never marry if it wasn't someone my intention was to be with for the rest of my life, right? And that is, again, that's a number of factors that I'm against polyamorous marriages, but the fact that they tend to be very unstable is one of them for that. And again, this book is, and prophets like this are still wrong in that polyamorous marriage is becoming more accepted among like the elite, intellectual elite, but at least so far it hasn't trickled down, and I hope it does not. So basically, I think they kind of have a point, even though I think their first point is wrong, and their second point, which depends on their first point, is therefore also not compelling. The third point, I think they're kind of right that there is this complementarity element to marriage that we have sort of erased. I think you can still have that within the context of what Lasch describes as a companionate marriage. I think it requires couples to really think about and talk about what their priorities are going to be. And I think if you do that, you will have a pretty low rate of divorce if you go into it with that expectation, with those discussions. And it's interesting, I learned somewhere recently that people who have average family incomes above like $500,000 a year maybe, the divorce rate is like 2%. And part of that might be they're staying together to preserve the assets, but I also think there is some connection between the cultural values that encourage you to build wealth and maintain wealth, and the cultural values that help you figure out this is how you're going to make marriage work. And so while I agree that, yeah, you don't want to go into the marriage expecting, okay, it doesn't work out, I can get divorced, I think it's a good thing that we have divorce and that it's relatively ready for us to get it. And I think even if you acknowledge the element of complementarity, you still tend to see that in same-sex couples. And so I've been thinking about this. I don't really have a specific point, but I just knew I wanted to make a video about this on May 17th. And because I wanted this to come out, but I've also been holding off releasing videos because of algorithm stuff. Leela's back, but I have stuff I've recorded when I was not recording with her that will come out after this. But anyways, basically, I guess in summary, my conclusion is I'm still not convinced, but obviously this is going to be something that would take a lot to convince me, right? I grew up believing from the start, from childhood, marriage was between two people of any sex. It was important to me. It's important to people I care about. And it would take something really compelling to convince me otherwise. But at the same time, these are people who are all committed Christians who believe that Christianity doesn't allow same-sex marriage, and it would take a lot to convince them otherwise. And I think there's sort of a common ground here, and they say they're targeting this at like well-meaning people who disagree, or well-meaning and open-minded people who disagree, something like that, and I think that's me. Yeah, I'm not convinced by the first two of their arguments, and I'm not convinced of their conclusion, but I've kind of been coming to the conclusion they might have a point about the value of complementarity. Back with a quick addendum from editing, which is, so speaking of the complementarity idea, I realized I forgot to mention something which you might have noticed, that when I talk about wanting to find a future wife, I say partner. And that is something that I learned to do because I sort of internalized this idea. It's interesting. So you have Christopher Lasch, his distinction between the patriarchal marriage and the companionate marriage. And I recognized that those were different ideas of marriage. And I sort of had the idea, growing up in a very progressive environment, that wife was associated with the patriarchal marriage form and partner is associated with the companionate marriage form. And I came across recently, because I've been trying to expose myself to different views, some conservative creator was saying that they would consider a woman saying if she wants a partner a huge red flag. And that surprised me, because again, I was just like, okay, that just means you don't want to go back to Christopher Lasch's idea of like a patriarchal marriage. The husband is the head of the household, makes all the decisions, controls all the finances, the wife has no say, right? So I was surprised by that. And so I asked a few right-leaning people I know who definitely don't believe in that view of marriage, and basically all the men agreed, yeah, if a woman said, I want a partner, that would be a red flag. And the woman in that group, who was a close friend of mine, was like, yeah, I kind of have that same association where men who say they want a wife, I'm wondering, are they looking for that dynamic? But at the same time, I would also kind of see saying partner as a red flag. So I've actually been trying to train myself out of saying that, but lifetime of ingrained habits, or at least an adulthood of ingrained habits. But that's because I think these people have more of a sense of, they value this idea of complementarity, where husband and wife are distinct roles, even if you're not following the prescriptive and patriarchal form of the patriarchal unit. And saying partner implies you see husband and wife as interchangeable, and then on to the next thing. And I already agree that I think in some ways we treat divorce too trivially, but I think also a lot of it is just people not really having the right discussions and the right expectations going into marriage. And so, anyways, wanted to talk about that because of May 17th coming up. So thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I'll see y'all in the next one.